Hello, my name is Matthew McKenna. Today, we're going to talk about how to redefine our third-party risk management programs with actionable insights. And this is going to revolve around three different themes: trust, collaboration, and mitigation. To start our story today, let's look at actor Kevin Bacon. There's a very famous parlor game played in the United States where you're given the name of an actor or actress, and you are supposed to connect them to Kevin Bacon as fast as you can. So as an example, I might say to you, Tom Hanks, and you would say back to me, well, Tom Hanks has a single degree of separation, having been in Apollo 13 together with Kevin Bacon. And the general idea behind this is that there are only 6 degrees of separation to any actor or actress you can name in the entire world to Kevin Bacon. Now, when we extend this out, this concept, to additional aspects of our lives, which we're familiar with, things like Twitter, we see that that degree of separation becomes less. We're separated by about 4.7 degrees on Twitter. And on Facebook, in fact, it's even less. It's 3.5 degrees. You'll be surprised to find out that our global supply chain is actually separated by 3 degrees or less. Now that's quite tight, and that shows quite a interreliability among our supply chain partners and shows a certain degree of fragility there. So today, what we're going to talk, we have broken this up into 4 points. We're going to talk about the challenge, and you're going to define the challenge a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Then from there, we're going to share with you a framework for how you can work with your vendors in terms of trust, collaboration, and mitigation. So those are the 3 core topics. Then we're going to walk into a case study. Very large company, global top 10, and how they redefined their third-party risk management program. And then we're going to talk about the takeaways, a couple of things that I want you to remember when we're done with all of this. So let's dive right in and let's talk about the challenge. So what we hear over and over in the market space is that organizations are struggling to create a third-party risk program that they can trust. In fact, most organizations don't really have good inventories or good understanding of who the vendors are that they work with, let alone know if they have sufficient safeguards in place to stop an attack or prevent a breach. Some of the statistics you can see there. 35% of organizations don't have sufficient resources. We continuously see third-party management teams understaffed. And this is where automation comes into play. How can we automate as much as possible to be able to manage our third-party relationships? And what's really interesting, despite the fact that we see that 2/3 of breaches are either directly or indirectly related to supply chain, actually over the last 2 years, 87% of organizations have faced some form of disruptive incident related to their third parties. So there's quite a few challenges that need to be addressed here. What are the things that we constantly hear when we're talking with the customers about their third-party risk management programs? One is, how do I continuously monitor the security posture of my vendors, right? Often we're very reliable on point-in-time assessments, meaning we get a snapshot at that moment of time, but we actually don't know how things are progressing and how things were historically. Second is scalability, right? We're working in many cases with thousands of vendors. We have to be able to tier those into sensible modes to be able to understand where that risk is in our organizations. The third piece is about collaboration. How do I engage with my vendors? How do I share with them information about the cyber risks that they face and be able to interact with them to reduce their cyber risk? Management of questionnaires. This is one we hear all the time. Organizations are sending out questionnaires. How do I know where those questionnaires went, where they stand in the process? How am I getting them back? And then how do I validate this back to the security posture of the organization? So it's part of having to take their word for it. And then really an important piece is, how do I demonstrate to my management that I'm really moving the dial when it comes to cyber risk of my supply chain? And then integrating this all into our organization's infrastructure. So a lot of challenges we hear when it comes to managing that third-party risk. Let's shift gears for one moment and let's look at this from the perspective of the cyber risk itself, right? So we see a lot of commonalities of long organizations where breaches are occurring. So this chart here on the right side gives us an example of the type of cybersecurity flaws in organizations that have been hit by ransomware. And what you see here is there is a high degree of correlation between when there is leaked credentials and that prevalence of a ransomware attack. Same thing holds true when we see, as we move down the line, weak TLS ciphers, exposed personal information, outdated operating systems, outdated web browsers, and so forth, right? So there's numerous indicators here which give us the idea of a precursor for an eventual ransomware attack. Now, there's numerous indicators along the way, but it's really how do we take that information which we're collecting about our vendors when it comes to their cyber risk to understand we truly have an issue of concern which needs to be addressed. The other part is why is it important to understand the cyber risk of our vendors? The path today is incredibly short to a breach. So this study here from the Verizon Data Breach Report of 2020 indicated that the majority of breaches are happening in less than 5 steps. Here you see at the far top left, over 150 of those are happening in a single step. That's essentially clicking on a link, phishing, whatnot. It's created that entryway into the organization. Then over 100 are 2 steps. So this is where the understanding of our external facing digital risks, really these low-hanging fruits, become really important to understand because the path is incredibly short to enter into that organization. So we have the possibility as organizations and possibility when we're working with our vendors to decrease that attack surface significantly. And it's not that much effort along the way. So let's shift gears now and let's start talking about the framework of how we can work with our vendors in a structure of trust, collaboration, and mitigation. So here's an overall framework. First and foremost, starting at the top in the middle, we need to identify who our vendors are. Very frequently, there's thousands of vendors. We don't really know who's responsible for them in the organization. We don't know who the contacts are necessarily over on the vendor side. We just know that we have these vendors. So identifying our vendors and understanding the relationships and the stakeholders within our organization and that of the vendors is really a key part to starting any program here and building that trust. The second piece is around classification, understanding how the vendor will impact your business. So in our case study, which we're going to touch upon in the next couple of slides, critical vendors in that organization had the possibility to stop production and actually have financial impacts of up to $100 million. Now, we have to look at that depending on our organizations, how we classify that as risks, right? So understanding how each third party drives a certain part of your business and that operational impact is highly important when we start to classify those vendors. The next one is understanding our ability to assess. Do we have a repeatable technique or methodology in place which allows us to consistently evaluate the governance, the cyber risk governance, the cyber risk hygiene, and the control of their organization? So that assessment phase is really a key piece. Then once we have these basic foundational pieces in place, we can shift over to what we call collaboration, being able to communicate with the partners. And we see inside projects that over 50% of the time is actually spent on building the right communication plan and engaging with vendors and getting buy-in from internal stakeholders. So being able to collaborate and communicate critical gaps that affect our cyber risk is truly important. The next part is mitigation. How do we structure that relationship or written program we have with our third-party vendors to actually mitigate the risk and track that mitigation to make sure that we are moving the dial when it comes to the cyber risks that we're exposed to through our vendors? And then finally, what it all comes down to is how do we report this back to our stakeholders and executives? Third-party risk, vendor risk has now become an issue which is seen at the board level. being able to concisely pull this all together to effectively share where that risk is sitting has become essential. So one of the first things we like to do with organizations is assess their maturity, right? And this goes through all of those factors that I just showed in the previous slide. But let's just take an example just to show the direction we're going in to understand how we assess maturity. First, we look at the program characteristics. Is there a written program in place which allows us to have a repeatable nature by which we engage with vendors to reduce cyber risk, right? And you can score yourself accordingly, whether you think you're on the very weak side, or yes, we're extremely mature and we've evolved in this. The next place to start is, do we even have that third-party inventory? That inventory may be decentralized, it may be in different parts of an organization, or is it really centralized, continuously updated, it's integrated, right? Next piece in there is relationship, the ownership of those third parties, right? Do we have stakeholders for every vendor, ownership of every vendor, internal risk managers for every vendor? How is that defined? And then finally, that process behind there is that process of how we engage with our vendors, mature, and do we know how to adjust that accordingly? So this is just a very quick snapshot. We can do that across all the phases, which I showed in the previous slide, but just to give you an idea of the questions that you should be asking to get an understanding is, where do we really sit and where's the gap and what do we need to address? The second phase is define success metrics. So this is the greatest starting point in any program, is what do we define as success? And it depends very much on your maturity, right? So we can look at three things, right? And these are just examples. You can create your own metrics of this. But one is, what is the maturity of our vendor risk program? So that goes back to the previous slide where we started looking at the different aspects and trying to gain an understanding of where we were in that life cycle, right? So you may say a metric of success is, we want to reduce the number of manual vendor evaluations, or we want to just be able to get an understanding, continuously monitor a certain degree of vendors, or classify those vendors into different tierings, right? So moving the dial on that maturity of your vendor risk management program, that could be one success metric. Another example could be increased internal transparency of the security posture, right? So this could be, how do we report back to our board, providing regular reports? How have we changed, if we're using cyber risk ratings, for example, how have we changed the score, not only of ourselves, but that of our vendor? So demonstration of some degree, one way or the other, of how we've actually reduced that cyber risk impact. And then finally, understanding where that risk sits in the ecosystem. So this is where we get more advanced and we start using things like cyber risk ratings to give us insight of where the commonality of issues across the entire landscape. And then how would we go about readdressing those, right? Are we getting vendors to engage with us in our ecosystem? So you can define your own success metrics. These are just some examples here, but it's very important to set those goals early within the process to let us know where we're going and what we're actually trying to achieve. From there, you can define a roadmap. And usually we have about three aspects in that roadmap. The first is the discover and implementation phase. The second is an expand and automation phase, and then an improve and innovation phase. So it's broken down into three aspects. And people, processes, and technology really make up the core of this. Now, just taking an example, we have our maturity. Let's say our maturity is low and we want to get into a higher degree of maturity, right? So for each of these areas around people, processes, and technology, we're going to have something that we do within our organization and with our vendors to move us ahead in that maturity process. So for the example, when we're in that discover and implementation phase, we may be building an awareness campaign, awareness with internal stakeholders, awareness with our vendors, why we're engaging with them, what we're trying to achieve, how it's going to function. From there, from the process side, we might build that design document for our program. And technologies, we may start to implement things like security ratings. We may be implementing questionnaire tooling there, risk quantification tooling, right? And this gives us, let's say, that deliverable at the end of the day of what we're trying to achieve. One is we understand the risk exposure of our ecosystem. And then second, we may have a third-party risk management handbook that we can share within our organization as well as communicate to our vendors. Second stage in there is expansion and automation. We want to be able to, from the people perspective, extend our stakeholder reach here. We want to get the buy-in from our executives to be able to get that visibility of our program and also get the buy-in of internal risk stakeholders there and be able to measure change. This is really the thing, showing that we're moving in a positive direction. From here, we may build in something like continuous monitoring, is that we're continuously watching how these vendors are evolving from a cyber risk perspective, and then build in automated triggering rules, meaning when something happens, how do we know what to do and how do we know how to engage with them? And from here, we may want to be able to be at the point where we have automated reporting to our operational teams and executive stakeholders. Then finally, when we become more advanced in the improvement and innovation phase, right, we may be looking for things on the process side like continuous SLAs that within 24 hours of something happening, we're able to react, collaborate, and mitigate that risk with our partners, right? We may start to integrate our technology into our internal ecosystem, ticketing systems, governance risk compliance tools, and so forth. And here's really where we start to get advanced, is we start to correlate that data that we see about the cyber risk of our vendors, whether it's coming in from the questionnaires or our cyber ratings tool, and being able to understand where those emerging risks are sitting and proactively engage with vendors to mitigate those risks. So defining a roadmap after we've set our key goals is really an important aspect here. So let's shift gears now into the case study. Let's take a look at a real life example here. Now, this organization is a top 10 global organization in terms of revenues, very critical industry in which they work. Now, before the project, when they were looking at their third-party risks, they were only focused on the most critical vendors, the ones that I talked about that could create $100 million in operational damage if they went down and impacted production. Now, a lot of the work that was being done here was manual. It was done with auditors and assessments and assurance reports, right? And so there was limited visibility here. And so what we tried to achieve with this customer here is we set the goal is what do we want to look like after the project, right? So here we wanted to be able to break different risk tierings. So we developed risk tiering based on the type of third party. And then we looked at what type of assurance activity. So those critical SOC relevant organizations, they would still work with a lot of insurance reports. There'd be audits involved, security ratings and questionnaires and whatnot. We'd use multiple tools to understand the risk and engage with those vendors. Then we had a type of third party with third parties with recurring issues. There would potentially be an audit, which would be engaged in. Other regulatory requirements was a third tiering. So those with GDPR requirements could be PCI or other, right? There we would use security ratings and a questionnaire and engage with those vendors. And then the final group, what we call the remaining vendors, we would just use security ratings to understand where that cyber risk was, and only if they were more critical to the impact, move them up a tier and start to engage with them with questionnaires, mitigation, and involvement, right? And so there were different types of assurance activities depending on the type of partner or vendor that we were looking at. Now, some basic things in terms of the project execution, some of the things that we did here. One was we said, for those vendors where we're using security ratings and questionnaires, is we wanted everyone to have a grade C of higher. So here I'm using security scorecard as the example here, right? Security scorecard uses a 0 to 100 scoring, which is then in turn correlated to a US grading system. So 90 to 100 is an A, 80 to 90 is a B, 70 to 80 is a C, and so forth. So what our data has showed us over the last 8 years is that those companies that have C's, D's, and F's, so that's 80 and below, are anywhere from 5 to 7 times more likely to experience a breach than those companies that have an A or a B, right? And so here we're looking at the fundamentals, and you can't focus in on everything. So this customer, they focused in on certain areas: network security of their vendors, the patching cadence. This is a great indication of cyber risk governance and maturity, and their application security. Then there were other areas there. If there were specific issues noticed, meaning we saw malware events in the last day, or there were open databases, open RDP ports, or we saw outdated operating systems or end-of-life products there, this would also be noted in that engagement there, right? At the same time, we built questionnaires and we linked those back into what we were looking for to be able to validate and understand what is really the situation at this vendor, right? And each of these risk areas that we were looking at was, they could be impacting our data privacy. They could be impacting, let's say, the intellectual property of our organization, or we were using services that they had which were public internet facing. So these were the key three risk areas, how we broke that down in terms of risk and mitigation. Now, the project outcome was great. So we ran a pilot with this customer. This customer is now well along out into their rollout, but I'm going to share some of the pilot results here. So first and foremost, there were a couple of things that we wanted to achieve here. We wanted to get engagement, right? So there were 32 third parties involved in the pilot. And in 16 weeks, we engaged in 85 stakeholder engagements, right? So we set a target of 75% to, let's say, reach these vendors, actually hit 82% engagement. And this really came around this part here in the middle. 50% of the time was spent on internal processes and stakeholders, communication strategies. Only through an effective communication strategy of what are we trying to achieve, but more importantly to the vendor, what's in it for them? Why should they engage back with you to reduce this risk? If you nail that communication strategy, then you'll get a high return in terms of engagement. And the next part there was moving the dial, let's say, getting them to start to interact and reduce the risk there. And here we actually had an improvement of 50% of the vendors, even though we only targeted 35% as kind of moving the dial there. And so this was a very modest, let's say, pilot of which we wanted to control things to see, are we moving things in the right direction? So we used about 2 to 6 weeks on the ratings improvements per vendor and 4 to 5 weeks on questionnaires. So again, communication strategy is the key takeaway here. So let me summarize this all together over the next couple of minutes with a couple of takeaways. It's going to be 3 takeaways here. First, trust is everything. How we engage our vendors will determine the success of your program. And as I mentioned, it's really about having your vendors understand what is your program about, why are you asking them to engage with them, and then finally, what's in it for them. So creating that clear path together with your vendor, giving them the expectations of this is why we're reaching out to you. This is what we're expecting. This is what we hope the result is. And this is what's in this for you in terms of understanding your own cyber risk builds that trust there. And early communication and frequent communication is essential. It's everything. Now, the next part here is around collaboration. There's a couple levels here. I can't overemphasize the importance of the communication aspect of the program. Starting off with your internal stakeholders, getting executive buy-in into why we're doing this. Remember, 2/3 of breaches are occurring as a result of the third parties we work with, either directly or indirectly. So getting buy-in from those internal stakeholders is everything. And then a clear articulation of that communication to the vendors of what the expectation is and why we're doing this. And then being able to communicate and collaborate and track that back to our executives as well as our vendors, letting our vendors know how that dial has been moved is a key component to the success of any program. The final piece here talks about continuous monitoring, progress, and mitigation. We really want to understand things of, are we moving things in the right direction? And this is just an example from our security ratings tool, where we look at how a group of vendors could be a tier of most critical vendors, how their portfolio score is moving. What's that collective risk of that group? The higher that score, the lower the collective risk of breaches. We also want to watch and take a look and say, how many issues are our vendors remediating proactively with us? How many new findings are we seeing in our vendors' landscape? Should we be alerted or concerned about this? How many organizations are monitored? How many have experienced breaches? How many are in compliance with their compliance mandates? So being able to continuously monitor that progress and also track that mitigation and report those back into our organization is a key component to the success of your program. So trust, collaboration, and mitigation are really the 3 takeaways, which I hope that you've gotten out of this session today. I'd like to thank you for your attention over the last 25 minutes. Don't hesitate to reach out to us at Security Scorecard if you have any questions or if we can be of any help in answering questions about how to better manage your third-party risk management programs. Thank you very much.